Wealthy heiress falls for a humble gardener. Her parents' outrage is shocking. Sophia Harrington sat at the grand dining table, her posture perfect, her expression poised, but inside, she felt like screaming. The opulent chandelier above her cast a golden glow over the table, where her parents, Charles and Eleanor, were engaged in their usual conversation about investments, social events, and connections. It was the same routine every evening, a performance of wealth and control. "Richard will be joining us tomorrow for dinner," Eleanor said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Sophia barely concealed her grimace. Richard, the epitome of everything she despised. Polished, self-assured, and as shallow as a puddle after a light rain. Her parents' insistence on pushing her toward him was a constant reminder of how little they understood her. "Do I have a say in this?" Sophia asked, her voice tinged with defiance. Charles looked up from his plate, his gaze sharp. "You're part of this family, Sophia. You'll do what's best for it." Sophia opened her mouth to retort but stopped herself. What was the point? Every argument ended the same way, with her parents doubling down on their expectations and her feeling like a pawn in their grand plans. After dinner, Sophia escaped to the garden. It was the only place where she felt remotely free. The sprawling estate boasted manicured lawns, stone paths, and vibrant flowers, all meticulously maintained by the gardening staff. As she wandered through the paths, she found herself drawn to the small greenhouse tucked away in the corner of the property. Inside, Ethan Moore was bent over a table, carefully repotting a plant. His hands moved with precision, his focus unwavering. He didn't notice Sophia at first, and she took a moment to observe him. There was something calming about the way he worked, as if the chaos of the world couldn't touch him here. "Do you always work this late?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. Ethan looked up, startled. His brown eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then he smiled, a small, genuine smile that caught her off guard. "Plants don't wait for the clock," he said. "They need care when they need it." Sophia stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. "Do you enjoy it?" Ethan nodded. "It's honest work. There's something satisfying about seeing things grow. It's grounding." His words struck a chord with Sophia. She envied his contentment, his ability to find peace in simplicity. For her, life was a constant performance, dictated by expectations and appearances. "I don't think I've ever felt grounded," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe you're looking in the wrong places?" The days that followed brought more encounters between Sophia and Ethan. Each time she visited the garden, their conversations grew longer, more personal. Sophia found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She told Ethan about her parents' expectations, her frustrations with the superficiality of her world, and her longing for something real. Ethan listened without judgment, sharing bits of his own life in return. He spoke about his dream of opening a nursery, of creating a space where people could connect with nature. His passion was infectious, and Sophia found herself drawn to his quiet strength. But their growing connection didn't go unnoticed. Eleanor began to comment on Sophia's frequent trips to the garden, her tone laced with suspicion. "Sophia, why do you spend so much time out there?" she asked one evening. Sophia shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "It's peaceful. I like the flowers." Eleanor narrowed her eyes but said nothing more. For now. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia and Ethan sat on a stone bench in the garden, their conversation flowing as naturally as the breeze. "You should come to the city one day," Sophia said. "See the galleries, the parks, there's more to life than this estate." Ethan chuckled. "And what would people think, seeing a gardener wandering around the city with an heiress?" Sophia rolled her eyes. "Who cares what they think? You deserve to see the world." Ethan's smile faded slightly. "It's not that simple. People like me, we don't get to just do what we want. There are responsibilities, limitations." Sophia placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. "You're more than what people see, Ethan. Don't let them define you." Her words lingered in the air, a promise and a challenge wrapped in one. Their bond deepened and so did the risks. Charles and Eleanor grew more suspicious, their watchful eyes a constant presence. Richard, too, began to notice Sophia's distracted demeanor and her tendency to disappear during social events. "Is something going on?" he asked her one evening, his tone dripping with entitlement. "Nothing you'd understand," Sophia replied, her patience wearing thin. Richard scowled but said nothing further. His suspicions, however, only grew. The next morning, Sophia woke with a sense of dread. Her encounters with Ethan had become a source of comfort, but they were also a ticking time bomb. She knew it was only a matter of time before her parents' suspicions turned into outright accusations. As she wandered into the garden, the air was cool and crisp, the scent of blooming roses filling her senses. Ethan was already there, pruning a row of bushes with careful precision. He looked up as she approached, his face lighting up with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. "Morning," she replied, sitting on the edge of a stone fountain nearby. "I needed some fresh air." Ethan paused, studying her. "Rough night?" Sophia sighed, running a hand through her hair. "My parents are getting suspicious. I think they're starting to figure out how much time I've been spending out here." Ethan's expression darkened slightly. "Do you think they'll say something?" "They'll do more than that," Sophia said with a bitter laugh. "They'll demand answers. And when they don't like those answers, they'll make threats. It's what they do." Ethan set down his shears and walked over to her, his presence steadying. "You don't have to face them alone, you know." Sophia looked up at him, her heart swelling at his words. "You don't know my parents. They're relentless. And I'm not afraid of them," Ethan said, his voice firm but gentle. "I care about you, Sophia. I'm not going anywhere." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. Sophia turned to see her mother, Eleanor, standing a few feet away, her face a mask of icy composure. "Sophia," Eleanor said, her tone sharp. "What are you doing?" Sophia stood, her posture tense. "Talking." Eleanor's eyes flicked to Ethan, her gaze cold and dismissive. "Talking to the gardener?" "His name is Ethan," Sophia snapped, surprising even herself with the force of her words. Eleanor's lips thinned, her disapproval evident. "Inside." "No." Sophia hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who gave her a small nod. Reluctantly, she followed her mother back to the house, bracing herself for the inevitable confrontation. In the drawing room, Charles was waiting, his expression grim. Eleanor closed the door behind them, her movements deliberate. "Sophia," Charles began, his tone measured but firm. "We need to talk about your behavior." Sophia crossed her arms, her defiance bubbling to the surface. "What behavior?" "Don't play coy," Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "You've been spending an inappropriate amount of time with that gardener." "His name is Ethan," Sophia repeated, her voice rising. "And there's nothing inappropriate about it." Charles stood, his towering presence filling the room. "You're an heiress, Sophia. Your actions reflect on this family. Do you have any idea what people would say if they found out you were fraternizing with the staff?" "I don't care what people say," Sophia shot back. "Ethan is kind, hardworking, and genuine, qualities you wouldn't recognize if they hit you in the face." Eleanor gasped, and Charles's face darkened with fury. "You will not speak to us like that," he thundered. "This ends now. If I see you with him again, there will be consequences." Sophia's hands trembled, but she refused to back down. "You can't control my life forever." "We'll see about that," Charles said, his voice cold. "You're dismissed." Sophia stormed out of the room, her heart pounding. She knew the fight wasn't over, but for now, she needed to breathe. She made her way back to the garden, where Ethan was waiting, his expression filled with concern. "They know," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan stepped closer, his presence calming. "What did they say?" "They want me to stop seeing you. They threatened me," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "But I don't care. I'm not giving up on this, on us." Ethan reached out, taking her hands in his. "Are you sure? Because this won't be easy." Sophia looked into his eyes, her resolve hardening. "I've never been more sure of anything." The days that followed were tense. Charles and Eleanor kept a close watch on Sophia, but she found ways to sneak into the garden to see Ethan. Their moments together were fleeting but precious, each one strengthening their bond. However, Richard wasn't blind to Sophia's behavior. His jealousy and entitlement grew with each passing day, and he began digging for information. When he finally uncovered the truth about Sophia and Ethan, he wasted no time in confronting her. "You're making a fool of yourself," Richard sneered during a private moment at a party. "Do you really think someone like him can give you what you deserve?" Sophia glared at him, her anger simmering. "Ethan gives me something you never could, honesty." Richard laughed, the sound cold and bitter. "You're throwing away your future for a fantasy." "No," Sophia said, her voice steady. "I'm choosing my future. One that's real." Richard's smirk faded, replaced by a look of contempt. "You'll regret this." The tension reached a boiling point when Charles confronted Ethan directly, threatening to ruin his life if he didn't stay away from Sophia. But Ethan, though shaken, refused to back down. "I love your daughter," Ethan said, his voice steady. "And I won't apologize for that." Charles's fury was palpable, but Ethan's words struck a chord he couldn't ignore. For the first time, Charles saw the depth of Ethan's feelings, and it left him unsettled. The confrontation with Charles left Ethan shaken but resolute. He returned to the garden, his mind racing. The stakes were higher now, but his feelings for Sophia had only grown stronger. He knew walking away wasn't an option, not when what they had felt so real. Sophia, too, felt the weight of her family's disapproval pressing down on her. Every interaction with her parents was tense, their unspoken anger hanging heavy in the air. Yet she refused to let them dictate her choices. Her moments with Ethan gave her strength, their connection a lifeline in a world that felt increasingly stifling. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia and Ethan met in the greenhouse, their secret sanctuary. The warm glow of the setting sun filtered through the glass, casting a golden light over the plants that surrounded them. "I don't know how much longer I can stay here," Sophia said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Every day, it feels like they're tightening their grip." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch steadying. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "You deserve to be free, to live your life on your own terms." Sophia looked at him, her heart aching with a mix of love and uncertainty. "But what about you? What happens if I leave? Will they come after you?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Let them. I'm not afraid of them, Sophia. They can't take away what we have." Her eyes filled with tears, and she leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. In that moment, the rest of the world faded away. It was just the two of them, holding on to each other in the face of everything. The Harringtons, however, were far from backing down. Charles and Eleanor convened a meeting with Richard, determined to devise a plan to end Sophia's relationship with Ethan once and for all. "This has gone on long enough," Charles said, his tone clipped. "We need to act before she makes a mistake she can't undo." Richard leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Leave it to me. I'll handle this." Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flicking between her husband and Richard. "What are you planning?" "Let's just say I have ways of making people see reason," Richard replied, his tone cold. A few days later, Ethan received a notice from his landlord, a sudden, unexplained eviction. At the same time, several local suppliers informed him that they could no longer do business with him, citing vague pressures from powerful figures in the community. It didn't take long for Ethan to piece together the truth. Richard was behind it. Ethan confronted Sophia in the garden that evening, his frustration evident. "They're trying to ruin me," he said, his voice taut with anger. "Richard is pulling strings to shut me down." Sophia's eyes flashed with fury. "This has gone too far. I won't let them do this to you." "But what can we do?" Ethan asked, his voice softening. "They have all the power." Sophia's expression hardened with determination. "Then we'll fight back. Together." Sophia's first move was to confront her parents directly. She walked into the drawing room where Charles and Eleanor were sitting, her head held high. "I know what you're doing," she said, her voice steady. "You're trying to destroy Ethan's life to force me into submission." Charles didn't deny it. "You've left us no choice, Sophia. You're jeopardizing everything we've worked for." "What you've worked for?" Sophia's voice rose. All you care about is your reputation. You don't care about me, about what makes me happy." Eleanor's expression softened, but Charles remained resolute. "You're too young to understand the consequences of your actions." "No," Sophia said firmly. "You're too blind to see that I'm not a pawn in your games." "I'm leaving," Eleanor gasped, but Charles's face darkened. "If you walk out that door, don't expect to come back?" Sophia swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. But she stood her ground. "Then I guess this is goodbye." With nowhere else to go, Sophia moved in with a friend in the city. The transition was jarring, but for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of freedom. She found a job at a local art gallery, using her creative skills to support herself. It wasn't easy, but it was hers. Ethan, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to rebuild what he had lost. With Sophia's encouragement, he reached out to local businesses and community members, sharing his vision for a nursery that would serve as a space for connection and growth. Slowly but surely, support began to trickle in. Their determination inspired others, and soon, a grassroots movement emerged, with people rallying behind Ethan and Sophia. The community's support became a powerful force, countering the Harringtons' influence and proving that even the most powerful could be challenged. As the weeks passed, Sophia and Ethan's lives took on a new rhythm, marked by struggle and resilience. For Sophia, each day was a lesson in independence. The art gallery offered her a creative outlet, but it was far from the life of luxury she had grown up with. She learned to budget carefully, rely on public transport, and appreciate the small victories that came with building a life on her own terms. Ethan faced his own challenges. Despite the community's support, rebuilding his business was an uphill battle. The suppliers who had cut ties with him were still wary, and new opportunities were slow to materialize. But Ethan was nothing if not persistent. He spent his days working on a small plot of land he had managed to lease, cultivating plants and nurturing his dream of opening a nursery. Through it all, Sophia and Ethan remained each other's greatest source of strength. They would meet in the evenings, often at a small park near Sophia's apartment, where they would sit beneath the trees and talk about their hopes and fears. One evening, as they sat together on a bench, Ethan turned to Sophia with a hesitant smile. "I've been thinking," he began. "Maybe we could start the nursery together." Sophia looked at him, surprised. "Together? Why not?" Ethan said, his voice growing more confident. "You've always had an eye for design and creativity. We could make it more than just a nursery, something special. A place where people can connect, relax, and feel at home." Sophia's heart swelled at his words. "I love that idea," she said, her smile bright. "Let's do it." The next few months were a whirlwind of planning and hard work. Sophia and Ethan poured their energy into building their vision. They designed the nursery as a welcoming space, combining Ethan's expertise in gardening with Sophia's artistic touch. There would be sections for plants and flowers, as well as a cozy cafe where visitors could enjoy tea or coffee surrounded by greenery. Word began to spread, and the community rallied around them. Local artists offered to contribute decor, small businesses donated supplies, and volunteers pitched in to help with the construction. It was a labor of love, and every small step forward felt like a victory. Meanwhile, the Harringtons watched from the sidelines, their influence over Sophia slipping further with each passing day. Eleanor, who had always been the more compassionate of the two, began to question whether they had been too harsh. She saw the joy and purpose in Sophia's eyes whenever she spoke about her work with Ethan, and it stirred something in her. One afternoon, Eleanor visited the gallery where Sophia worked. The encounter was tense, but there was a softness in Eleanor's demeanor that Sophia hadn't seen before. "I heard about the nursery," Eleanor said, her voice tentative. "It sounds impressive." Sophia regarded her mother warily. "Why are you here?" Eleanor hesitated before replying. "Because I miss you. And because I'm starting to wonder if I've been wrong about a lot of things." Sophia's heart ached at the admission, but she held her ground. "It's not too late to change, Mom. But you have to mean it." Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's time I tried." Eleanor's change of heart marked a turning point, but Charles remained staunch in his disapproval. He refused to acknowledge Sophia and Ethan's achievements, clinging to the belief that they were tarnishing the Harrington name. Richard, meanwhile, grew increasingly bitter. His failed attempts to sabotage Ethan had left him humiliated, and he began to lash out in petty ways, spreading rumors and attempting to undermine their progress. But the strength of Sophia and Ethan's bond, combined with the community's support, proved to be an insurmountable force. The nursery finally opened on a crisp spring morning. Sophia and Ethan stood at the entrance, watching as visitors streamed in, their faces filled with wonder and delight. The air buzzed with excitement, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the aroma of coffee from the cafe. For Sophia, it was a moment of triumph, a testament to everything they had overcome. For Ethan, it was a dream realized, made even more meaningful by the woman who had stood by his side through it all. The grand opening of the nursery marked the beginning of a new chapter for Sophia and Ethan, but the journey was far from over. While the community embraced the space, the Harrington family remained a looming shadow. Charles, unwilling to admit defeat, doubled down on his disapproval, his silence a stark reminder of the rift that had grown between him and Sophia. Eleanor, however, began to make small but meaningful gestures of reconciliation. She visited the nursery one quiet afternoon, arriving unannounced. Sophia was tending to a row of hydrangeas when she saw her mother step hesitantly through the gate. "Mom," Sophia said, her voice a mix of surprise and caution. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I wanted to see what you've built." Sophia stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "And?" Eleanor looked around, her expression softening. "It's beautiful, Sophia. I can see how much heart you've put into it." Sophia's guard dropped slightly at the sincerity in her mother's tone. "It means a lot that you're here," she admitted. "I know I haven't made things easy for you," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "But I want to try to understand. To support you." Sophia studied her mother's face, searching for any hint of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded. "I'd like that." As Eleanor began to visit the nursery more often, her presence brought a sense of cautious hope to Sophia and Ethan. She helped with small tasks, chatted with visitors, and even began to appreciate the simplicity and beauty of the work. Slowly but surely, she became an unexpected ally. But Charles remained unmoved. His refusal to acknowledge the nursery or Sophia's choices was a source of pain that Sophia tried to bury. Despite her growing independence, the thought of her father's disappointment lingered at the edges of her mind. One evening, as Sophia and Ethan sat in the cafe after closing, Sophia finally voiced her frustration. "I don't know if he'll ever come around," she said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "It's like I don't exist to him anymore." Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "He's missing out," he said softly. "But that's his choice, not yours." Sophia looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You always know what to say." Ethan smiled. "That's because I know you. And I know you're stronger than you think." As the nursery flourished, its success began to draw attention beyond the local community. A feature in a prominent magazine highlighted its unique blend of nature and creativity, sparking interest from people across the region. Visitors came not just for the plants and the cafe but for the story behind it, a tale of resilience, love, and defying expectations. Sophia and Ethan worked tirelessly to keep up with the growing demand, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. They celebrated each milestone, no matter how small, cherishing the life they were building together. Meanwhile, Richard's attempts to tarnish their reputation continued to falter. His bitterness and schemes only served to alienate him further, even within the Harrington social circles. Charles, though still unwilling to reconcile with Sophia, began to distance himself from Richard, recognizing the cracks in his once favored candidate for Sophia's future. Eleanor, on the other hand, found herself advocating for Sophia more openly. At a dinner with Charles, she finally confronted him about his stubbornness. "Do you even see how happy she is?" Eleanor asked, her voice filled with uncharacteristic passion. "She's thriving, Charles. She's doing something meaningful with her life. Isn't that what we've always wanted for her?" Charles's expression hardened. "She's thrown away her inheritance, her place in society, for love," Eleanor interrupted. For integrity? Can you honestly say you would have had the courage to do the same in her position? Charles's silence spoke volumes, but Eleanor wasn't done. You're losing her, Charles. And one day you'll regret it. As Eleanor's words settled over Charles, he found himself wrestling with emotions he wasn't used to confronting. His pride and staunch belief in tradition had blinded him to the possibility that his daughter's choices, while unconventional, might not be wrong. Still, he remained silent, unwilling to concede, even to himself, that he might have been wrong. Back at the nursery, life continued to flourish. Sophia and Ethan had created more than a business. They had built a community. Local families gathered at the cafe on weekends, artists displayed their work in the garden, and schoolchildren visited to learn about plants and sustainability. It was a space filled with life, laughter, and connection, a far cry from the sterile opulence of the Harrington estate. One afternoon, as Sophia arranged fresh flowers in the cafe, Eleanor walked in, accompanied by a man Sophia hadn't expected to see. Charles stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Mom?" Sophia said, her voice uncertain as her eyes flicked between her parents. Eleanor offered a reassuring smile. "Your father wanted to see the nursery." Sophia set the flowers down, her heart pounding. "Really?" Charles stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the room. The vibrant energy, the welcoming atmosphere, it was a world apart from the rigid perfection he had always demanded. He paused in front of a display of potted plants, running a hand over one of the leaves. "This is impressive," he said finally, his voice gruff. Sophia blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "It means a lot that you're here." Charles turned to face her, his expression softening just slightly. "Your mother's right, you've built something remarkable." Sophia felt a swell of emotion, but she held it back. "I couldn't have done it without Ethan." Charles's jaw tightened at the mention of Ethan's name, but he nodded. "I'd like to meet him." Eleanor found Ethan tending to a row of herbs outside and gently guided him inside. Ethan, ever composed, wiped his hands on his apron and approached Charles with a steady gaze. "Mr. Harrington," Ethan said, extending a hand. Charles hesitated for a moment before shaking it. "Ethan." The exchange was brief but significant. For the first time, Charles truly looked at Ethan, not as a gardener or an obstacle, but as a person. He saw the strength in his eyes, the quiet determination that had carried him through adversity. "I don't agree with everything that's happened," Charles said, his voice measured. "But I can see that you've worked hard for this." Ethan nodded. "I appreciate that. Sophia and I both have." Charles glanced at Sophia, who stood watching with a mix of hope and trepidation. "You've proven me wrong," he admitted, his voice softening. "I'm not saying I understand it, but I'll try." The words, while not a full endorsement, were a step forward, a crack in the wall that had divided them. Sophia felt a weight lift from her chest. For the first time in years, she saw the possibility of rebuilding her relationship with her father, not on his terms, but on equal ground. As weeks passed, Charles began to visit the nursery more frequently, often accompanied by Eleanor. While he still struggled to fully embrace Sophia's choices, he made an effort to understand them. He even began to offer advice, drawing on his business acumen to help Sophia and Ethan navigate the challenges of running a growing enterprise. Richard, meanwhile, faded further into the background. His bitterness and schemes had left him isolated, and even Charles had grown weary of his antics. The Harringtons quietly severed ties with him, leaving Sophia and Ethan to build their lives free from his interference. Sophia and Ethan's nursery continued to thrive, becoming a beloved fixture in the community. Their journey had been anything but easy, but it had forged a bond that was unshakable. Together, they had not only defied expectations but had created something lasting, something real. As the nursery blossomed, so did the lives of those it touched. Customers would often linger in the cafe, sharing stories over coffee, while parents brought their children to play among the flowers. Sophia and Ethan had created more than a business. They had fostered a community that thrived on connection and kindness. Charles's visits, though sporadic, became more comfortable. He would sit in the cafe with Eleanor, quietly observing the space. Occasionally, he offered Sophia advice on expansion strategies or financial management. Though his demeanor remained guarded, there were moments when his pride in her work was unmistakable. One afternoon, Charles arrived unannounced and found Ethan alone in the greenhouse, carefully tending to a bed of seedlings. For a moment, Charles simply watched, the precision and care in Ethan's work a stark contrast to the boardrooms and balance sheets that had defined his own life. "You're meticulous," Charles said, breaking the silence. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Plants demand it," he replied simply. "They don't grow if you cut corners." Charles nodded, stepping closer. "I imagine that's a lesson that applies to more than just plants." "It does," Ethan said, meeting Charles's gaze. "And I think Sophia's learned that too." Charles exhaled, his posture softening. "She's always been determined. Stubborn even. I suppose I should have seen this coming." Ethan smiled faintly. "She gets it from you." The comment caught Charles off guard, and for a moment he looked as though he might argue. But then he chuckled, a low, quiet sound that carried a hint of respect. Despite the tentative progress, the shadow of the past still lingered. Sophia and Ethan knew that rebuilding trust with Charles would take time, and perhaps there would always be parts of him that struggled to accept their choices. But they also understood that change was a process, one that required patience and persistence. Eleanor, meanwhile, became a fixture at the nursery, her once polished demeanor softening as she embraced the joy of being part of something genuine. She even began to share her own stories with visitors, offering a glimpse of the woman she had been before the weight of societal expectations had shaped her. As the nursery prepared for its first annual community festival, Sophia and Ethan threw themselves into the planning. The event would feature local vendors, live music, and workshops on gardening and sustainability. It was their way of giving back to the community that had supported them through everything. On the day of the festival, the nursery buzzed with activity. Families wandered among the stalls, children laughed as they painted flower pots, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh blooms and baked goods. Sophia stood at the entrance, greeting visitors with a radiant smile. Charles and Eleanor arrived together, their presence drawing murmurs of curiosity from the crowd. Charles, ever the businessman, scanned the setup with a critical eye. But as he watched the joy on people's faces, his expression softened. Eleanor nudged him gently. "You should be proud, Charles. This is your daughter's legacy." Charles nodded slowly. "She's built something remarkable." "I can't deny that." As the sun set and the festival wound down, Sophia and Ethan stood in the center of the nursery, taking in the sight of their hard work come to life. The twinkling fairy lights cast a warm glow over the space, and the laughter of the crowd began to fade into the evening air. Sophia turned to Ethan, her eyes shining. "Can you believe we did this?" Ethan smiled, pulling her into his arms. "I can. Because I've always believed in you." They stood together in the quiet of the garden, surrounded by the beauty they had created. The path to this moment had been long and filled with challenges, but it had also been worth every step. As the festival wrapped up, Sophia and Ethan lingered in the nursery long after the last guest had departed. The warm glow of the fairy lights bathed the garden in a soft, golden hue. The air was filled with the scent of flowers, and the distant hum of crickets provided a soothing backdrop to the quiet moment. Sophia walked slowly through the rows of plants, her fingertips brushing the leaves. She stopped in front of a row of hydrangeas, the same ones she had tended to during those early days of building the nursery. "It's hard to believe how far we've come," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Sometimes, it feels like it all happened so fast." Ethan joined her, his hands in his pockets as he gazed at the hydrangeas. "It wasn't fast," he said gently. "Every step, every struggle, it all led us here. And it's been worth it." Sophia turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Do you think they'll ever fully accept us?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I think they're trying in their own way. But even if they don't, it doesn't change what we've built. This is ours, Sophia." She nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you. And I couldn't have done it without you," Ethan replied. "You've taught me that it's okay to dream bigger than I thought I could." Meanwhile, Charles and Eleanor sat in their car parked just outside the nursery. Eleanor looked out the window at the softly lit garden, her expression thoughtful. "She's happy," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Charles tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his face unreadable. Isn't that what matters?" Eleanor asked, her tone gentle but insistent. "You don't have to agree with her choices, Charles. But you have to let her live her life." Charles exhaled deeply, leaning back in his seat. "I've spent my whole life trying to control everything: business, reputation, even my family. And now, I'm realizing that some things aren't mine to control." Eleanor reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not too late to be part of her life. But it has to start with you." Charles nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "I just want what's best for her." "She's already found it," Eleanor said with a small smile. "You just have to see it." Over the following weeks, Charles began to make small but meaningful gestures of reconciliation. He visited the nursery more frequently, offering to help with tasks that aligned with his expertise. While he still carried his reservations, he made an effort to understand the life Sophia and Ethan had built. Eleanor, ever the peacemaker, encouraged these visits, often acting as a bridge between Charles and Sophia. Slowly but surely, the walls between father and daughter began to crumble. One afternoon, Charles approached Ethan as he worked on a new display for the cafe. He stood silently for a moment before speaking. "You've built something impressive here," Charles said, his tone gruff but sincere. Ethan looked up, meeting his gaze. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that." Charles hesitated before continuing. "Sophia, she's always been determined. I didn't see it at first, but I understand now. She wouldn't be here without you." Ethan straightened, his expression steady. "She's stronger than you realize, Mr. Harrington. I'm just lucky to be part of her life." Charles nodded, a small but significant gesture of respect. "Take care of her. That's all I ask." "I will," Ethan promised. As the days turned into weeks, the bonds between Sophia, Ethan, and her parents continued to strengthen. While Charles wasn't yet effusive with praise, his actions spoke louder than his words. He began to involve himself in small ways, from offering advice on scaling the nursery to quietly supporting local vendors who collaborated with Ethan and Sophia. It was his way of saying he cared, even if he couldn't fully articulate it. Eleanor, ever the emotional heart of the family, became a regular at the nursery, often seen chatting with customers or helping Sophia arrange flowers in the cafe. Her presence brought a sense of normalcy to the space, a reminder that reconciliation was possible even after years of conflict. One sunny afternoon, Sophia and Ethan stood together in the nursery, preparing for a small celebration to mark the first anniversary of its opening. The event was simple, a gathering of friends, family, and community members who had supported them along the way. Charles and Eleanor arrived together, Charles carrying a box of vintage gardening tools he had sourced as a gift for the nursery. It was a rare gesture, and when he handed the box to Sophia, his expression softened. "I thought these might be useful," he said, his tone almost bashful. Sophia opened the box, her breath catching as she examined the beautifully crafted tools. "Dad, this is perfect. Thank you." Charles nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "You've done something remarkable here, Sophia. I'm proud of you." The words, simple as they were, carried a weight that made Sophia's heart ache. She reached out and hugged her father, something she hadn't done in years. Charles hesitated for a moment before wrapping his arms around her. As the celebration began, the nursery buzzed with life. Laughter echoed through the garden as children played among the flowers, and the cafe was filled with the hum of conversation. Guests marveled at the beauty of the space, the love and care evident in every corner. Ethan stood near the entrance, greeting visitors with his characteristic warmth. When Sophia joined him, he turned to her, his smile bright. "Look at what we've built," he said, his voice filled with wonder. Sophia slipped her hand into his, her eyes shining. "We couldn't have done it without each other." As the sun began to set, the celebration wound down, leaving a quiet peace over the nursery. Sophia and Ethan stood together in the garden, surrounded by the plants and flowers that had become a symbol of their journey. "I think we finally found it," Sophia said softly. Found what? Ethan asked, tilting his head. Home, she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. Ethan smiled, his heart full. Home, he echoed,